well, thanks so much. This is kind of a fun thing to do on a Saturday afternoon. I hope you're all enjoying the meeting so far. And I just want to, before I get too deep into the presentation, I just want to acknowledge my collaborators. So this is really a joint effort of what I'm going to be talking about. We have Paige Warren, Desiree Narango, Kelly Larson, Alex Contasta, Joan Milam, Christopher Bang, Mark Goddard, Pete Mara, and Peter Groffman. It's because of all of them that I can say with utmost enthusiasm that I love my job because I get to work with such amazing people. With that said, I would like to kind of frame this talk as a talk about the birds and the bees. And so I don't want anybody to be kind of getting all antsy in your seat because it's not going to be that talk, but rather a talk about these guys. And although for me, I don't need much convincing about why should we care about birds and bees, but I know for a lot of people that really kind of framing their importance within this ecosystem framework, I think really gets the point across of why these birds and bees and other species are important. So for example, on the left is a Carolina chickadee, and colleague Doug Tallamy, he painstakingly counted the total number of insects that a single clutch of chickadees brought to their nest and estimated it about 7,000 to 9,000. And if we think about that number and then start multiplying it across the landscape and across all the different chickadees, I'm sure most of you have seen chickadees in your backyards. And so what it really boils down to is that chickadees are performing an incredible service in terms of the number of insects that they're eating. And it's not just chickadees that are eating insects. And then when we think about bees, the USDA has estimated that they provide a $56 billion service in terms of pollinating our crops. And although we mostly hear about honeybees, it's our native bees as well that are pollinating our crops and our trees and our flowers and all these other different species, plant species, so that we can have some of these other ecosystem services in terms of shade and other things from our plants. Okay, so the birds and the bees are really important. But they need us. We have a crisis in our hands. And I like this New Yorker cartoon because I think it really does kind of really set up what's going on our planet. But I'm an optimistic person. And so although, yes, we have humans, as the Earth is saying, but we also can do something good. And so that is really the main driver of my research, is really trying to figure out some of these positive solutions, recognizing the dire straits that we're in. And why are we in such dire straits? So I've dedicated my career to studying and researching wildlife populations and communities across cities and suburbs. And one of the main reasons why we're seeing a loss of species is because of habitat loss. And so one way to look at this is I have these two images here. One on the left is kind of a more pristine woodland, that typical that you would see here in New England and Massachusetts. And then on the right, what we would call as non-habitat. And so many times I've gone into the woods, it's beautiful places, and then I go in a couple of weeks later or a year later, and then I see something on the right, that the trees have been replaced by development. And it's because of habitat loss that there's been two really big papers that have come out recently that has really demonstrated the devastation that habitat loss has caused. So there's estimated of 2.9 billion fewer birds since 1970, and estimated 25% fewer bee species since 2006. And it's because of these numbers that we are in this biodiversity crisis. However, as I mentioned, I'm an optimistic person. And so in another way of looking at habitat loss and non-habitat is that once the bulldozers leave and the development is finished, what we see are these novel habitats that are in place. And so I like to think of it as habitat loss and alteration. And it's because of this alteration that I think there's hope and that there's all of this potential. And so, as I mentioned, I focus my research in residential landscapes and backyards. And you might be wondering, well, why should we care about yards? Well, we had a recent paper that came out in October in Bioscience, where we estimated the total amount of land covered by residential yards within the United States. And we estimated that as something around 30% of US lands. And so to put that into perspective, I have another figure up here. It's, compared to protected lands, it's about 7 times greater the amount of land. And although the majority of our yards are in these urban and suburban areas in terms of the number of yards, the majority of lands that are yards are in rural areas. So in other words, this isn't just an urban or suburban issue when we think about our yards, but this is everywhere. Yards are everywhere across the gradient. And because it's not going, the other component about yards, why I get very excited about it, is because there's so much variation and there's so much potential for these yards to provide wildlife habitat. And so a main component of my research is to provide the science to inform management so that we can have our yards provide wildlife habitat for birds, bees, and people too. So I want to highlight 3 research projects that I think really demonstrate how yards can serve as habitat for biodiversity. So first I'll talk about birds and people, then bees and lawns, and then I'm going to hop back to birds and landscape designs. So I just want everybody to take a moment. It's funny because the room, I can see the room, and that's really great. So I can see the people are there, but it's purple. So it looks kind of wild in there. I don't know if there's like the lighting in there. That's really neat. But one of the things that I want everybody to do, and I can actually see you, I have 2 images here in this idea of homogenization. And so I want folks to raise their hand if they think Boston is on the left and Phoenix is on the right. Okay, raise your hand if you think that Phoenix is on the left and Boston is on the right. All right, I see a couple of hands. It's kind of hard, my screen is really small. So basically what I want to point out is that, Boston is on the right, and Phoenix is on the left. But the point here is that I could have shown a whole bunch of different images from this bird's eye view, and it would be really tricky to figure out what city is what. And so basically Boston, Phoenix, Baltimore, they all look the same. They have the same format. And so this idea of this homogenization of our urban landscapes. And we're also seeing that with our wildlife, with our birds. And so we have kind of these classic urban species. You have pigeons, you have European starlings, you have house sparrows. And these are also located across all of our cities and suburbs, across the United States, and for some of these species, also at this global scale. However, when you go from that bird's eye view to a worm's eye view, we see a lot of heterogeneity. We see a lot of variation. So here's the second part of this quiz is how many of you think that Miami is on the left and Phoenix is on the right? Anybody think that Phoenix is on the left and Miami is on the right? All right, so no hands. So this is actually a trick question. Both of these images are from Phoenix, Arizona. And these 2 landscapes are probably about 10 miles apart from each other. And it's because of this variation that, again, that gives me hope. And so for my dissertation research, what I went out to look at is that I could see the differences in these 2 different types of landscapes. And I was very curious to know whether or not birds also notice these differences, and that could we plant our way out of this biodiversity crisis. And so for my dissertation research, I worked with the Central Arizona Phoenix Long-Term Ecological Research Project, also known as CAP-LTER. And as part of this project, I went out and looked at the bird community in 40 different neighborhoods scattered across the city of Phoenix, the whole metro area. And the yards were in urban, suburban, and rural landscapes, and also along a socioeconomic gradient, so high income, medium income, and low income. At each of these 40 neighborhoods, in addition to going out and monitoring the birds, I went back and looked at what types of plants were there. Did they have these exotic species like the one on the left, or did they have more of these desert landscapes? And then I was able to co-locate all of these different survey points within US Census block groups. And so we also had an idea of what types of people were potentially observing these birds. And then working with our social science colleagues, these same 40 neighborhoods, there's a social survey that was administered to them to ask about their opinions about the environment, natural environment. And so I'm going to go into a little bit more detail about these different components. And so the first thing I wanted to know is how are birds responding to these different landscapes? And what we found is that when you increase the abundance of the exotic vegetation, lo and behold, you increase the abundance of these exotic and general bird species, our pigeons, our starlings, and house sparrows. However, when you increase the abundance of these desert plants, like the palo verdes and saguaros and other types of cacti, we found an increase in abundance of these desert birds. Species like Gambel's quail, cactus wren, and greater roadrunner. These are birds you're never going to see in Illinois. I'm never going to see these species in Massachusetts. These are birds that are unique to the Sonoran Desert. And although these results were not very surprising, this is one of the first studies to actually document this relationship that when you plant desert plants, you get desert birds, or native plants, native birds. So again, the importance of having the science behind these management recommendations is really key, because we want to make sure that we're promoting things that actually work. So I'm also very interested in how people interact with the nature in their backyards. And so by co-locating all of our sites within US Census block groups, we're able to get at these types of questions and these relationships, so that primarily in neighborhoods that had a higher percentage of lower income renters or predominantly identified as Latino, we saw an increase in abundance of our pigeons and starlings and house sparrows. Whereas in the neighborhoods that had a higher percentage of higher income neighbors, predominantly owner occupied and predominantly white, they had an increase in abundance of these special birds, these desert birds, the Gambel's quail, cactus wren, roadrunner, and then a whole bunch of other species as well. And so what this really identified was this unequal access to desert birds. And so in addition to some of these other environmental injustices that we've heard about in terms of pollution and noise, we're also seeing this play out in terms of biodiversity relationships and people. But the question remained was, well, did people really notice this? Did people really care? I know for me, I notice all the birds in my backyard, but I was wondering if this was a universal truth, that people were really interested in the birds in their backyards. And so working with our social science colleagues, they administered this Phoenix area social survey to those same 40 neighborhoods where we knew what birds were there, what birds were related to what types of plants and trees. And there's a whole bunch of different questions, but there was one particular question that asked the respondents their level of satisfaction with a bird variety in their neighborhood. And so what we were able to do is to compare what respondents said, what people said, to the actual desert birds in their neighborhoods based on our point count surveys when we go out and monitor the bird community. And we found a very strong relationship, namely that in neighborhoods that had more desert birds, people were more satisfied with their birds. And when we think about satisfaction, so this is a common term of looking at well-being. And so another way to look at this is that desert birds make people happy. And although there's a whole bunch of other factors that align with desert bird richness and satisfaction with bird variety, what this suggests is that neighborhoods that are good for people are also good for birds. So once I finished my dissertation research, I started thinking about lawns and bees as well. And so I remember in my dissertation defense, somebody had asked me, what is the one thing that we can do to help desert birds? And I said, get rid of all of our lawns. And everybody clapped, and that was great. And I passed my defense. But I kept thinking about that, about getting rid of our lawns. And so maybe in Phoenix, that definitely makes sense. But in other parts of the country, it also makes sense, but it might not be as feasible. And I started doing a little bit more research, and I came across this figure of 163,800 square kilometers. That's the amount of lawn in the United States, although this is from a paper from 2005, so I'm guessing the number is probably a little bit higher by now. And this, when you think, okay, well, what does that mean in terms of 163,800 square kilometers? So that's roughly the size of Maine, New Hampshire, Vermont, and Massachusetts. So it's a lot of area. And not only is it just green, but in terms of the amount of management, that the intensity of management that goes into keeping these lawns green is really phenomenal. So whether it's daily irrigation, weekly mowing, or seasonally applying fertilizers, we're putting a lot of inputs into these lawns. And in addition to them not having very much structure, think because of all these inputs, some of my colleagues have called these biodiversity deserts, or the Cornell Lab of Ornithology calls it the relatively useless for birds and bees. And I kept coming back to that idea. And I used to be that same person of like, yeah, we got to get rid of all of our lawns. They're evil, they're bad. But I kept coming back to this number of 163,800 square kilometers. And I realized it was an impossible feat to get rid of them all. And so I started really kind of reframing this idea of how do we make our lawns less bad? And I think this whole mantra, it really kind of sums up the work that I do, is that our cities and suburbs and our backyards most likely will never go back to the native ecosystems that they have replaced, but there are these opportunities to make them less bad. And for this research, I focused on lawn mowing because this is an activity that almost everybody is doing who has a lawn. And one of the things that I noted is that every time we mow, there's a potential that we might be removing habitat. And so one of the things, though, the reason why we're mowing our lawns and doing a lot of these other activities in our yards is because our yards are an extension of our home. And so they're really, to think of them as these social systems, but they're really ecological systems as well. They're these mixed social and ecological systems. And the main reason why we're managing them is because we want them to look nice. But by making them look nice could have some negative consequences for habitat, especially when we think about removing some of these floral resources that might be present. And it was because of these two ideas that I started thinking, well, maybe let's really test to see whether or not these flowers that are in our lawns could really provide bee habitat. And this is around the time when everybody was freaking out about bees. There's so much concern, mostly about honeybees, but also native bees. And we were starting to see a huge decline in bees overall. And although I'm an ornithologist by training, the way that I needed to answer this question about making our lawns less bad, I switched over to start studying bees. And so this was an exciting component professionally for me as well. So I pitched this idea to the National Science Foundation to test this hypothesis that if we mow our lawns less frequently, then we would have more flowers. And if we had more lawn flowers, then we would have more bees. And I conducted this study in Springfield, Massachusetts. This is the third largest city in the state. And I worked within 16 different yards, and they mostly looked like the one I have here on the screen. And one thing to really note here is that these yards did not have pollinator gardens. They did not have vegetable gardens, because I really wanted to focus in on the habitat value of these lawn-dominated yards without looking at any of these other floral resources. And also to look at whether or not we could have these management decisions and how they relate to bee habitat. And so the yards were, we conducted the study over a course of 2 years, from May until September for both years. And then the yards were divided into 3 different mowing frequencies. Yards got either mowed every week, every 2 weeks, or every 3 weeks. And I just want to take a pause here to mention the challenges of conducting any sort of experimental research in outside of the lab. And then it becomes even more challenging when you're doing it in people's backyards. And so one of the things that everybody had to agree on by participating in the study was to not fertilize or irrigate their yards. And the main component, though, is lawn mowing frequency. And in order to make sure that people did not go rogue and, if they were assigned the 1 week mow, that they were only mowing every 3 weeks or vice versa, we provided free lawn mowing service for the course of the 2 years of the study. Which was one way of trying to give back to the householders that let us go and do science in their yard. And it was also a recruitment strategy as well. And so just a really fun fact, over the course of 2 years, we pushed the mower from the equivalent of walking from Springfield, Massachusetts down to Philadelphia and back again. So it was a lot. And the picture that I have in the top left, this was a yard that got mowed every week over the course of 2 years. And we clocked about 75 miles within that yard. So when we think about some of these ecosystem services that these yards could provide, one thing could be exercise, assuming that it's you that's pushing the mower. All the better if you're using an electric or a non-engine mower as well. Anyways, it was just kind of a fun component of this study. But let's go back to the hypothesis that we were testing. And so the the first thing I want to highlight is that within these yards, within these 16 lawn-dominated yards, we identified 58 different species that were growing spontaneously in the lawns. And so these were not plants that were planted, these were all within the seed bank. And to get at that level of natural history within these yards, still, to me, I still find very extraordinary. And so I guess when I first started this study, when I would look out at lawns, I would just think, oh, it's just grass. But when you start looking down and you start noticing, like, oh, wow, actually, there's a lot going on there. But in terms of the hypothesis, if you mow your lawns less frequently, are there more lawn flowers? And what our research showed is yes, there are. Again, similar to if you plant native plants or desert plants, you get desert birds. It was kind of like, well, duh, that makes sense. But this is one of the first studies to really test these ideas. And again, having that importance there of if we're trying to ask people to mow our lawns less frequently, we want to let them know that yes, indeed, it will provide more floral resources. Okay, but what about the bees? And so one of the things that was pretty astonishing over the course of the 2 years of the study is that we identified 111 different species of bees. And so again, I want to remind you what these lawns looked like. They didn't have anything special. And 111, what does that mean? So that represents about a quarter of all bees that have been recorded in the state of Massachusetts. And Massachusetts is a pretty well sampled site. And there's roughly 35 species per yard. And then this bee that I have here on the right, Lasioglossum ilioense. So it's not very exciting. It's about the size of a grain of rice. But what was exciting from our study was that this was the most abundant and widespread bee that we collected. To put that into perspective, the last time Lasioglossum ilioense was recorded in the state of Massachusetts was in the 1920s, and it only represented 2 individuals, and it was from the eastern part of the state. So we got all excited about it. We did some genetic tests to think maybe we had a new species, but it's a dirtball common, as Sam Droege says, Lasioglossum ilioense. And I think what we were able to document is the northward movement of this species moving up. It's really common further south. And so again, representing the importance of looking at some of these places that people will have dismissed because you never know what you're going to find. And we had a number of county records that we identified here in this Springfield study. And just want to take a moment to just highlight some of the bees that we observed in these yards, and just to enjoy the diversity of them. If you have, I don't know, maybe an hour or 2, maybe 3 to kill, what I suggest is just Google Sam Droege USGS. These are all his photographs. He's got 1,000 others, and they're just amazing. You can really see their speciality in terms of how hairy they are and their ability to collect pollen, the colors, the metallic green bees. I'm still astonished that that's their actual color. And then who doesn't love a bumblebee? They're super, super cute. I think they're the megafauna of the bumblebee world or the bee world. Anyway, this again, as a natural historian at heart, I find that it was just pretty amazing that all of these bees were buzzing around in these yards. But going back to the hypothesis about making our lawns less bad. So we know that if we mow our lawns less frequently, we have more lawn flowers. And do we have more bees? And the answer is yes, and it's a little bit complicated. And so the figure that I have on the right, we have the lawn mowing frequency on the x-axis and the number of bees and bee abundance on the y-axis. And what you'll see is that the yards that were mowed every 2 weeks had the highest bee abundance compared to the yards mowed every week and every 3 weeks. And through all of our statistical analyses and statistical modeling that we did, we're very confident that the bees are responding to the floral resources in the lawns. And so we know that the floral resources are driving these patterns. And we also know that there's a few species that are really dominating the bee community, and that's pretty common in a lot of bee studies. And so you have some of these, what we call these workhorse species, and they might be doing all of the pollination services. But it was surprising that we didn't see this relationship that the yards that were mowed every 3 weeks also, we hypothesized that they would have more bees within them. And so it was a little surprising, but when I think about it a little bit more, one thought we had is that in addition to the yards that had more flowers, they also had taller grass. And so like the the lizard glossum ilioense, most of these bees were about the size of a grain of rice. And so one thing that we're thinking is that the blades of grass might have obscured some of the flowers that made them less optimal for these bees. We don't know for certain, but that's one idea that we have going. So to go back to this question of whether or not these are biological deserts. And so if it were up to me, I wish all of our yards looked something like this on the right. But I know that this takes a lot of time, it takes money, it takes a green thumb, and for some people, it just doesn't look nice. And so in addition to planting these pollinator gardens, what our research is showing is that you can also do a little bit less. And we call this the lazy lawnmower approach. And it's economical, it's time saving, and it's simple. Anyone can do it. And so in addition to all of these other factors, I think when we're thinking about pollinator conservation or bird conservation or anything, we want to make sure that there's a whole bunch of different ways that people can tap in and be a part of the conservation movements. And so in some, what we found is that this 2-week solution was what was really the best for providing for bee abundance. And the other thing to note is that the yards that were mowed every week, whenever we would go to them, we always like, well, they don't really look like they need to be mowed, but it was part of a study, so they have to be mowed every week. The yards that we that were assigned the 2-week mowing regime, every time we go to them, we thought, yeah, I think they need a little bit of mowing now. And so we'd go and they'd look really kind of clean and nice after we finished our mowing activities. But the yards that were assigned to the 3-week mowing regime, every time we got to those houses, before we even got the lawnmower out of the car, the householder was running down to greet us. And they're like, I'm so glad you're here. My neighbors were getting really upset and they kept offering to come over to mow the lawn. And they're like, no, you can't. It's part of a science experiment. But what this really demonstrates is that people are just not ready to let their lawns go. And so again, that importance of the aesthetics, that is the main component. And we want to make sure that we're balancing the aesthetics with ways that we can create bee habitat. So the last study I want to highlight here is basically taking the Phoenix research and the Springfield research, the birds and the bees, and just kind of exploding it. And so this is a project called the American Residential Macro System Project. And we are looking at 6 cities across the United States. Here I have them highlighted: Boston, Baltimore, Miami, Minneapolis, St. Paul, Phoenix, and Los Angeles. And within them, trying to get a better sense of how, in my sense, how birds are responding to different types of yard management. And so this is a project that has about 12 or so other principal investigators. We've got people that are looking at soils, looking at the plants, looking at water, looking at the people, looking at ordinances, and we're all looking at different components, and I'm leading the wildlife component to really get at this question of whether or not we can plant our way out of this biodiversity crisis. And so we looked at 4 different types of yards in terms of their design. So whereas in Phoenix, just looked at the kind of the mesic yards versus the xeric yards, the kind of the Miami type of yards and the desert type of yards. Whereas here we worked with the National Wildlife Federation and we worked in some of these yards that were certified, wildlife certified habitat. We also looked at yards that had some sort of water conservation feature. So the yards east of the Mississippi, these would all be some sort of rain garden, whereas the yards in the west, in the arid states, in Los Angeles and Phoenix, this would be xeriscaping. And then looked at 2 different types of lawn management, those that had high management. And so these would be yards that had a fertilizer application, and then the yards on the right, low management lawns, so more of a do-it-yourself, I'll mow it when I get to it kind of atmosphere. And so these were the 4, what we were hypothesizing, these 4 typical types of yards. And in addition to looking at the bird communities in these yards, we also looked at these parks within these 6 cities and to get a sense of what are the more natural communities, both in terms of the plants and the soils, and in this case, the birds. And what we hypothesized here is that the yards that were landscaped with wildlife in mind, these wildlife certified yards, the bird community would be more similar to those in the parks and to the landscapes, the areas that what these yards had replaced. And what we found in general, when we looked at the total number of when we looked at the total number of species, so species richness, what we found was that the yards had more species overall compared to the parks. But the yards also had more non-native species, so species like pigeons and starlings and house sparrows. Whereas the parks, when we looked at the bird communities in the parks, they had more species of conservation concern. They had more insectivores and more native species. But there's many ways for us to look at the diversity of wildlife. And so this is just one, by looking at the total number of species. Another way of looking at it is by looking at turnover. And so what does turnover mean? So one of the ways, what I want to highlight in this figure at the top right is that I have in blue the wildlife certified yards. You see that bump there, that's the CD. But that bump is more aligned with the unmanaged park areas and the natural areas, so the parks. So when we're looking at turnover, the wildlife certified yards are, in terms of the bird community, is more similar to the parks. So this really supported our hypothesis. But what does turnover mean? So another way to look at it. So say we have a wildlife certified yard and we go to our first yard and we look at the bird community. Oh, we see a cardinal, an American robin, and a pileated woodpecker. Pretty cool. Then we go to another wildlife certified yard. And then we see two new species. There's a wood thrush and there's a chickadee. And then we go to another wildlife certified yard and we pick up another species. There's a catbird. And then we go to another wildlife certified yard. And then there's yet another new species, a yellow warbler. So the point is that if we were to increase the number of wildlife certified yards, we would increase the total different types of niches for different species, and therefore providing more habitat for different species and having more species overall, and having different species in these different types of yards. Whereas when we look at turnover in these lawn-dominated yards, these high management lawns, what we see is that you go to all of these yards and you're basically seeing the same species. You're seeing your pigeons, your house sparrows, and here I have grackles just to mix things up a little bit. And so what this is demonstrating is that our lawn-dominated yards are homogenizing. This is one way that they're homogenizing the bird community. And so, another way to look at this is that we have these some yards that are managed for lawns, but then these wildlife certified yards are really acting in terms of the bird community more similar to the parks. So again, I feel like a broken record, but this is again one of the first studies to be able to test the efficacy of the National Wildlife Federation certification program to really understand whether or not if you build these wildlife habitats, does wildlife respond? And so in this case, what we're able to find is that yes, they are responding. Okay. So I hope I now convinced you all that our yards can provide habitat for biodiversity, and also just some of the numbers behind it, the quantification of it. And it's not just like, oh yeah, this is good, but that we have the data to demonstrate that yes, it's really important for us to be planting these native plants, providing wildlife habitat, because the birds and the bees are responding to that. But in addition to providing habitat, we also can think about what's going on in terms of advancing climate resiliency. And so when we think about, I have these two images here, the one on the top, not as many trees, the one on the bottom, more trees. And we know if there's more trees, there's more habitat. And some additional research has also demonstrated these synergistic benefits. Is that when you have more trees, they infiltrate some of the rainfall runoff. And so you get drier basements. And there's ambient temperatures will decrease when there's more trees. And that is really a key component, especially in these more urban and suburban environments. Having trees is a really important thing to keep these neighborhoods cool. And I touched on this idea of well-being a little bit earlier, but the other thing that I want to highlight here is, again, this idea that when you have more habitat, you have more wildlife, and that has implications for how we interact with nature in our backyards. And so there's been research in Switzerland that has demonstrated that the more ecological gardening features that you have, so more wildlife-friendly features, the aesthetics of those yards actually increase. And so again, the importance of making sure if we're doing something different, that it looks nice is really key. But there's some research that demonstrates that it doesn't have to look ugly. It can look really, really nice. And then there's also research from Sheffield, England, that demonstrated that if you are able to the more species of birds that you can recognize, you have this stronger connection with nature. And we know that when we have more wildlife habitat features, we have more species. So we're starting to see these links and these processes within these different systems that, again, the well-being for people, we have these synergistic benefits. It's good for people, it's good for wildlife. But there's also several barriers and also opportunities to having wildlife habitat in our backyards and front yards. And so I keep mentioning this idea of these social barriers. Again, we want to make sure that these yards are aesthetically pleasing. There's been lots of research from Kelly Larson and her team at Arizona State University that has looked at what are the main motivating factors for people landscaping the management decisions in their landscapes, and aesthetics is number one. The other thing that's really important to acknowledge is that many times we're landscaping our yards, not necessarily for us, but because of our neighbors. And we want to adhere to these social norms. And so there's a couple of ways that we can address these components. One is having these cues to care. And this is Joe Nassar from the University of Michigan had this concept that when you have signage to let people know that it's intentional and not neglect, can have some real power in terms of getting your neighbors involved. And we have research that shows that when you partner with local gardeners, with master gardeners, that they're already playing around with the plants. And if we can get them to be a bit more wildlife friendly, to have more native plants, then that's another key way for us to get in and get more people thinking about wildlife. There's economic barriers as well. Sometimes these can be cost prohibitive. In terms of going in and planting trees and removing your lawns and things like that. But there's also a number of different programs that provide rebates or tax incentives to reduce the types of management. And so, again, really trying to figure out all these different programs. And one thing I want to mention is that a lot of these programs, they're not wildlife programs. They are utilities. So there's the electric company that has a tree planting program, and there's the soil resources program in Minnesota that has this way of reseeding your lawn for bees. And then finally, there's these policy barriers. And so there's local weed laws that prohibit you to have your vegetation above a certain height. And also, for the most part, yards are not really part of the conversation when we talk about conservation. And so what we are seeing, though, is that cities and suburbs are revising their local ordinances. So I've seen in Wisconsin, 2 cities have increase the height of their plants, especially for the month of May, using some of the research from our study in Springfield to guide those changes. And then also the Biden and Harris administration's Executive Order 14008, also known as the 30 by 30, protecting 30% of US lands and water by the year 2030. If we want to get to that number, the only way we can do it is by including yards in that conversation. Almost done, bringing it all back home. So I hope by now I've convinced you that there's many opportunities for us to contribute to conservation. And here's just a simplified way of looking at the different ways that people can tap in depending on their motivation, their time, their energy. It all makes a difference. But a few things that I just want to highlight that are really important: plant native plants, garden for wildlife, and mow and manage less. And then this other idea that is this a moment or is this a movement? And so I think we really are on this cusp that we are starting to see a lot of people talking about lawns and rethinking how they're doing their lawn management. And so I think we have this really great opportunity to really harness this energy and really try to make our yards really important for birds and wildlife and everybody else. And this idea of having our yards for something other than aesthetics is not new. One of the, as Nancy mentioned in the introduction, so I have a degree in American history. And so when I started working in yards, I kept thinking about victory gardens because it has kind of the same component. Whereas, with the victory gardens during World War II, they were addressing food shortages due to the high enlistment of farmers. But we're kind of doing the same thing. We're growing food, not just for people, but we're growing food for wildlife. And so I think what we tried to do in this recent publication, in this bioscience publication, what you see here on the right is a figure in that publication. And we modeled it after some of the Victory Garden posters because we really wanted to celebrate what is possible in our yards, and that it wasn't just all the stats and the figures and the numbers and the tables, but it was just something that was lovely, that really showed the joy of walking outside and looking at a chickadee, seeing a fox, or looking at butterflies and other species. And the other thing I want to highlight is that this is not new. We've been doing this for 50 years. And so I just want to call out that some colleagues of mine from the U.S. Forest Service, so Jack Ward Thomas and Dick DeGraff, they wrote this publication in 1973, and this was the inspiration for the National Wildlife Federation's certification program. And it's this lovely booklet that shows what your yard could look like when you start managing for wildlife, and it shows it in the first 5 years, and then in 10 years, and then 20 years. And so again, I think what we're trying to do with this Humanity for Habitat is really demonstrating that everybody has a role to play, and the importance of looking at some of these barriers and opportunities as well. Because when we think about this idea of humanity for habitat, what I'm hoping is that when we do something, then we have an opportunity to see something. And that when we see something, that we can feel something. And when we feel something, what we know is that when we're studying the birds and the bees and we're looking at the flowers and the trees, it really is all about a thing called love. So with that, I'd be happy to take questions.